"He's her last chance," said the mechanic. The boss's reaction left everyone in shock. Mike Johnson was breathing heavily as he pushed the wheelchair through the dealership's hallways. His work shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands trembled as he gripped the cold metal of the chair where Mrs. Margaret sat, a grey-haired woman who seemed to be fighting her own exhaustion. The sound of the wheels on the marble floor echoed through the luxurious corridors, breaking the solemn silence of the place. Mike knew he shouldn't be there, that his presence on that floor was forbidden, but he couldn't wait any longer. He had tried every possible means, every polite way to get an audience with the boss, but he always hit the same cold response from the secretaries. "Mrs. Margaret, are you sure you want to do this?" Mike whispered, pausing for a moment in front of the glass door of the meeting room. The elderly woman raised her tired eyes and nodded. Her wrinkled hands clutched a worn cloth bag, where she kept some papers yellowed with time. She had insisted on bringing those documents, saying they might be important. On the other side of the glass, Mike could see Richard Anderson leading a meeting with the company's managers. The impeccably dressed man gestured with authority, pointing to charts and tables displaying the dealership's profits. At 45, Richard had built an empire in the automotive industry, known throughout New York City for his efficiency and also for his coldness in business. Mike took a deep breath and pushed the glass door open forcefully. The sudden noise made all the executives turn toward the entrance, their faces a mix of surprise and indignation. Richard stopped mid-presentation, his dark eyes narrowing as he saw the uniformed mechanic barging into his meeting. "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" Richard shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "How dare you interrupt my meeting?" Mike's legs felt weak, but he kept pushing the wheelchair to the center of the room. The managers stepped back, forming a circle around the unlikely pair, the scent of expensive cologne mixed with the grease odor clinging to Mike's work clothes. "Mr. Richard, I tried to reach you through normal channels, but no one would let me near you," Mike said, his voice trembling slightly. "This woman here needs your help, and I can't stand seeing her suffer anymore. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out." Now, back to the story. Richard looked at the woman in the wheelchair with disdain. She appeared to be in her 70s, dressed in simple, clean but clearly outdated clothes. Her hair was tied in a loose bun, and her hands shook slightly. He couldn't understand why a workshop employee would bring a stranger into his private meeting. "I don't know who this woman is, but both of you will leave immediately or I'll call security," Richard threatened, pointing to the door. "You're her last chance," Mike said, his voice gaining desperate firmness. "Mrs. Margaret needs urgent surgery, and all the public hospitals have waiting lists that could take months. She doesn't have that kind of time." Mike's statement cast a heavy silence over the room. The managers exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to leave or stay. Richard felt rising irritation burning in his chest. How dare this mechanic disrupt his business with some stranger's personal problems? "Listen carefully, Mike," Richard said, recalling the employee's name. "I'm not a favor bank or a charity institution. If this woman needs medical treatment, there are proper channels for that. Now get out of here before I take more severe measures." Mrs. Margaret, who had remained silent until then, slowly raised her head. Her eyes met Richard Anderson's and she offered a tired, sorrowful smile. She began softly humming an old melody, almost whispering the words, "Sleep, sleep, my little one, for Mama is here. Sleep, sleep, my love, you need not fear." Her trembling voice spread through the room like an unexpected breeze. Richard felt something strange stir in his chest, as if a long-locked door was being forced open. That melody awakened distant echoes in his memory, fragments of a childhood he had buried deep. "Stop that," Richard said, but his voice came out weaker than he intended. Mrs. Margaret kept humming, her eyes fixed on the businessman's face. Mike Johnson watched the scene with growing hope, sensing something shifting in his boss's expression. Richard's hardened demeanor was beginning to crack, like a mask falling apart. "How do you know that song?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I sang it to you every night, my son," Mrs. Margaret replied, her words heavy with decades of longing. "When you had nightmares, when you had a fever, when you simply wanted me by your side until you fell asleep. Richard's world seemed to collapse around him. The managers, the spreadsheets, the profits, all became irrelevant in the face of that impossible revelation. He approached the wheelchair with unsteady steps, as if walking in a dream. "That can't be," Richard murmured. "My mother. She abandoned me when I was a child. She never came back." Mrs. Margaret opened her cloth bag with shaky hands and pulled out a yellowed envelope. From inside, she retrieved several old photographs, some faded with time. The first showed a young woman holding a small boy in her arms, both smiling at the camera. "You were 5 in this picture," she said, handing the photo to Richard. "It was your birthday, and I managed to buy a small cake with the tips from my cleaning job." Richard took the photo with trembling hands. It was undeniably him. The same nose, the same dark eyes, the same birthmark on his forehead that he hid behind his bangs. But the woman in the photo was young and beautiful, a far cry from the frail woman before him. "Why did you come back now?" Richard asked, his voice heavy with old pain. "After 40 years, why show up now?" Mike decided to step in, sensing he needed to explain how they had gotten there. "Mr. Anderson, I found Mrs. Margaret 3 months ago," he said. "She had fainted at the door of my neighborhood church in Queens. When she woke up at the hospital, she kept repeating your name. At first, I thought it was delirium, but she had these photos. And she also had this." Mike pulled an old yellowed newspaper clipping from his pocket, carefully preserved. It was an article about Richard's graduation from business school 15 years ago. In the photo, he stood in a cap and gown, holding his diploma and smiling. "She kept every article about you," Mike continued. "There's a whole box at her place, full of news about your businesses, your achievements. She followed your life all these years, even from afar." Richard looked at his mother with a mix of disbelief and anger. How could she say she followed him from afar if she had never truly tried to find him? How could she speak of a mother's love if she had left him in his grandmother's care when he needed her most? "You abandoned me," accused Richard, his voice gaining strength. "You left home and never came back. Grandma Rose had to raise me alone, working 2 jobs to support me. She spent her whole life telling me you chose a better life, free from the responsibility of a child." Mrs. Margaret closed her eyes, as if her son's words were physical blows. Tears began to stream down her wrinkled cheeks, leaving glistening trails on her dry skin. "I never abandoned you by choice, Richard," she said, her voice breaking. "I left because I had no other option. Your father was gone, leaving behind massive debts. The creditors were threatening to take the house you lived in. I had to work far away in other cities to save enough money to pay it all off." "That's a lie," Richard shot back, but his conviction wavered. "I came back when you turned 8, Mrs. Margaret continued. "I had saved enough for us to start a new life. But when I arrived at your grandmother's house, you were playing in the yard. I called your name, and you looked at me like I was a stranger. When I tried to hug you, you ran inside screaming that you didn't want to talk to strangers." Mike Johnson watched the conversation with a heavy heart. He had lost his own mother at a young age and could feel the pain on both sides. The pain of a mother forced to choose between being present and ensuring survival, and the pain of a child who felt abandoned when he needed love the most. "Grandma Rose told me you didn't want anything to do with me," Richard murmured, his certainty crumbling. "Your grandmother was trying to protect you," Mrs. Margaret replied. "She thought it would be better for you to grow up without the confusion of a mother who came and went. She asked me to leave again, said I had already caused enough pain. I agreed because I thought she was right, that you'd be happier without me." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. Richard felt his legs weaken and steadied himself against the conference table. The managers were still there, silent witnesses to the family drama unfolding before them. Some looked uncomfortable, others genuinely moved. "But why did you decide that without asking me?" Richard demanded, addressing both his mother and the memory of his grandmother. "I was a child, but I had the right to know the truth." "Children shouldn't have to make those kinds of decisions," Mrs. Margaret answered. "Rose thought it was best for you to forget me and move on. And maybe she was right. Look at the successful man you've become. Mike sensed it was time to reveal the rest of the story. Over the past few months, he had uncovered more about Mrs. Margaret, details that might help Richard understand the full extent of his mother's sacrifice. "Mr. Anderson, there's something else you should know," Mike said hesitantly. "Mrs. Margaret didn't just work to save money back then. After she left your grandmother's house, she kept sending you money every month." "What do you mean?" Richard asked. "I found the receipts at her place," Mike explained. "Bank transfers, deposits, sometimes even cash sent by mail. For 15 years, she sent money to help raise you. She only stopped when you turned 18. Richard felt the world spin around him. He had never known. Grandma Rose always said they were struggling financially, that they had to cut corners everywhere. He remembered going to school in patched-up clothes, eating rice and beans every day. How was it possible that money was coming in without him knowing? "Why did Grandma Rose never tell me about this?" asked Richard, more to himself than to anyone else. "Your grandmother was a proud woman," replied Mrs. Margaret. "She didn't want you to know we were sharing in your upbringing. She wanted all the credit, wanted you to see her as the only person who cared about you, and maybe she was right to want that. She truly loved you very much." Mike looked at Mrs. Margaret with concern. He could see she was growing pale, that the emotional toll of the conversation was taking its toll. She had insisted on coming despite her fragile health, and now he feared she might faint. "Mrs. Margaret, are you feeling all right?" asked Mike, stepping closer to the wheelchair. "I'm fine, dear," she replied, but her voice was weaker. "I'm just a little tired. I've wanted to have this talk for so long." Richard noticed his mother's frailty and felt a pang of guilt. Regardless of all the resentment he carried, she was an elderly woman clearly struggling with health issues. He moved closer to the wheelchair and knelt before her. "Tell me about this surgery you need," said Richard, his voice softer. Mrs. Margaret looked at Mike, as if asking for permission to speak. He nodded, encouraging her to be honest about her condition. "It's my heart, son," she said. "The doctors say I have a valve problem, something that needs surgery soon. The public hospital scheduled it for 6 months from now, but the cardiologist said I might not have that much time." "And how much does it cost to do the surgery privately?" asked Richard, already guessing the answer. "Mike researched several hospitals," replied Mrs. Margaret. "The cheapest one charges $60,000. It's more money than I've ever seen in my life." Richard closed his eyes, trying to process everything. $60,000 was an amount he could easily spend in a weekend, maybe less than the gas for his imported car in a month. And there was his mother, a woman who had given up decades of her life to ensure he had a better future, dying for lack of money. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" asked Richard. "Why wait until you were in such a desperate situation?" "I tried, my son," replied Mrs. Margaret, her tears flowing again. "Many times over the years, but every time I went to your office, the security guards wouldn't let me in. They said you didn't take unscheduled visits, and when I tried to explain who I was, they thought I was lying." Mike nodded in confirmation. "It's true, Mr. Anderson. Mrs. Margaret told me she's been coming here at least once a month for the past 2 years. She always told the guards she was your mother, but they never believed her. They thought she was just another person trying to take advantage of your generosity." Richard remembered the strict instructions he'd given to company security. He'd ordered them not to let in any unannounced visitors. Tired of dealing with people asking for favors or trying to sell things, he never imagined that policy was keeping his own mother from reaching him. "There's one more thing," said Mike, hesitating. "Mrs. Margaret didn't want me to tell you this, but I think you should know. She works as a cleaner in the building next to your office. She got that job a year ago, specifically to stay close to where you work." "What do you mean?" asked Richard, confused. "She cleans the offices in the commercial building across the street," explained Mike. "Every morning she arrives early and stands by the window, waiting to see you walk into the dealership. Sometimes she catches a glimpse of you from afar, when you're coming or going by car." The revelation hit Richard like a punch to the gut. His mother had spent the last year working just a few feet away from him, only for the chance to occasionally see him from a distance. While he made millions selling luxury cars, she scrubbed bathrooms just for the right to watch him through a building's windows. "Why didn't she try to approach me on the street?" Richard asked. "She did try once," Mike replied. But when she got close, your security team pushed her away. She told me one of them was really rude, said she should stop chasing rich bosses if she didn't want trouble. Richard vaguely remembered the incident. His security had reported an elderly woman trying to approach him outside the office, and they'd handled it per protocol. He hadn't even paid attention, trusting his team's judgment. After that, she gave up on trying to reach you directly, Mike continued. She said she didn't want to cause problems for you, didn't want you to feel embarrassed. So she settled for watching from afar, until her health took a turn. One of the managers, silent until then, cleared his throat. Mr. Anderson, perhaps we should continue this conversation privately, he suggested. The meeting can be postponed. Richard looked around the room, realizing an audience had just witnessed the most personal drama of his life. He nodded, agreeing privacy was best. Everyone, let's reschedule for tomorrow, Richard said. Mike, please take Mrs. Margaret to my private office. We need to talk without interruptions. The managers filed out, some whispering about the extraordinary scene they'd just seen. Mike wheeled Mrs. Margaret's chair out of the conference room, following Richard down the hall to his office. Richard's office mirrored his personality, functional, polished, and imposing. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a panoramic view of New York City, while mahogany shelves displayed awards and business accolades. A massive desk anchored the room, flanked by Italian leather chairs. Mike positioned Mrs. Margaret's wheelchair near the desk as Richard took his executive seat. The contrast between the three was stark. The sharply dressed, powerful businessman, the humble mechanic in his work uniform, and the elderly woman carrying decades of silent suffering. Now tell me everything, Richard said, his voice steadier. How did you find her, Mike? And how did you figure out the connection between us? Mike took a deep breath before answering. Like I said, I found Mrs. Margaret passed out at the church doors. When she woke up at the hospital, she was confused, but kept repeating your name. The doctors thought she was delirious, but I decided to look into it. And you just believed her, just like that? Richard asked. Not at first, Mike admitted. But she showed me the photos and newspaper clippings, and there was something in how she talked about you, a mix of pride and sadness that felt real. Plus, she knew details about your life that weren't in the papers. What kind of details? Mrs. Margaret answered for herself. You had a scar on your left knee from a bike fall when you were 7, she said. You cried more over the broken bike than the cut itself. And you always had the habit of playing with your hair when you're nervous, just like you're doing now. Richard abruptly stopped fiddling with his hair, realizing he was doing exactly that. These were intimate details only someone very close to him would know, memories from a time he had tried to forget. She also knew about your fear of thunderstorms, Mike added. She told me you'd always run to her room during storms, and she'd sing that lullaby until you fell asleep. Richard's emotional defenses were crumbling fast. He remembered perfectly running to his mother's room during storms, hiding under the covers while she sang softly to calm him. It was a memory he had buried so deep, he'd almost convinced himself it was just a dream. After I confirmed she really was your mother, I started taking care of her, Mike continued. She was living in a terrible boarding house, sharing a tiny room with 2 other women. The food was awful, the place was always dirty, and she was clearly sick. Where is she living now? Richard asked. I rented a small room in the back of my house, Mike replied. It's not much, but at least it's clean and she has privacy. My wife, Christine, has been helping take care of her too. Richard looked at Mike with a mix of admiration and shame. A mechanic who earned a fraction of what he made had taken on the responsibility of caring for his mother, while he, who had enough money to buy the entire hospital, hadn't even known she existed. Why did you do this? Richard asked. Why take on that responsibility? Mike hesitated before answering, as if deciding how much of his own story to share. I lost my mother when I was 15, he finally said. She worked as a maid to support us after my father left. One day she got sick at work but didn't want to see a doctor because she was afraid of losing her job. By the time we got her to the hospital, it was too late. I'm sorry, Richard said sincerely. My mother's employer could have easily paid for her treatment, Mike continued, a hint of bitterness in his voice. but she said it wasn't her responsibility to look after her employees' health. My mother died without a proper goodbye, without the help she needed. Richard began to understand Mike's motivation. He was trying to spare Mrs. Margaret the same fate as his own mother, while also giving Richard the chance he himself never had. "When I saw Mrs. Margaret in that state, I thought of my mother," Mike said. "And when I found out you were her son, I thought maybe I could stop another family from being torn apart by misunderstandings and pride." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now back to the story. Mrs. Margaret had stayed quiet during Richard and Mike's conversation, but now she spoke up. "Mike has been more of a son to me these past months than I ever deserved in my whole life," she said, looking fondly at the mechanic. "He and Christine treat me like family. They take me to the doctor, make sure I'm eating right. I'll never be able to repay their kindness." "Then why didn't you come find me sooner?" Richard asked. "Why wait until things got so bad?" "I didn't want to bother you," Mrs. Margaret replied. "Mike insisted you had the right to know about my situation, but I was afraid you'd reject me. I'd rather keep watching you from afar than risk being humiliated in front of you. It was only when the doctor said she had at most 3 months without surgery that I decided to act," explained Mike. "I couldn't wait any longer. Even if you fired me, even if you called security, I had to try." Richard stood up from his chair and walked to the window, looking down at the city below. From that 20th floor, people looked like ants, cars like toys. He had always felt powerful in that position, as if he were above the mundane problems of ordinary people. Now, he discovered his own mother had spent months looking up toward his window like a beggar, waiting for scraps of attention. "I need to know one more thing," said Richard, without turning around. "All these years, did you never try to rebuild your life? Never remarried, never had other children?" Mrs. Margaret smiled sadly. "I remarried when you were 15, she said, "to a good man named Jack. He knew my story, knew I had a son who didn't know me. We had 2 children together." Richard turned abruptly. "I have siblings?" he asked, his voice full of surprise. "You have a brother and a sister," confirmed Mrs. Margaret. "Paul and Melissa. They're 29 and 27, respectively." "And where are they? Why didn't they come with you?" Mrs. Margaret lowered her eyes, clearly embarrassed. "They don't know I came here today," she admitted. "In fact, they don't know you exist." "What do you mean?" "When I married Jack, I decided not to tell them about you," explained Mrs. Margaret. "I thought it would be easier for everyone if I started fresh. Jack believed I had been a single mother and that the father had abandoned the child. I never corrected that impression." Richard felt a new wave of anger rise in his chest. "So you built a new family and erased me completely from it?" he accused. "It wasn't like that," replied Mrs. Margaret, tears welling in her eyes again. "I never forgot you. I always knew I'd have to tell them the truth someday. But the more time passed, the harder it became." "And now?" asked Richard. "What were you planning to do if I agreed to help with the surgery? How would you explain where the money came from?" "I don't know," admitted Mrs. Margaret. "I was so desperate I didn't think beyond getting your help. Maybe I could have said it was a government program or a charity campaign." Mike noticed the conversation was becoming too tense and decided to intervene. "Mr. Richard, I know this is very complicated, but Mrs. Margaret isn't feeling well. Maybe we should take her home and continue this another day." Richard looked at his mother and realized Mike was right. She was pale and breathing heavily. The emotional stress was clearly worsening her already fragile health. "Are you feeling sick?" asked Richard, stepping closer to the wheelchair. "A little dizzy," admitted Mrs. Margaret, "and my chest hurts." Richard felt panic rise in his throat. No matter what resentment he carried, he couldn't let something happen to his mother right in front of him. "Mike, let's take her to the hospital now," said Richard, grabbing his suit jacket. "You don't have to, son," said Mrs. Margaret weakly. "I just need my medicine and some rest." "What medicine?" asked Richard. Mike pulled a small bottle from his pocket and gave Mrs. Margaret 2 pills along with a water bottle. "It's for her heart," explained Mike. "The doctor said she has to take it whenever she feels chest pain or shortness of breath." Richard watched as his mother took the pills with trembling hands. It was surreal to realize that the woman who had raised him in his early years was there, fragile and dependent on medication just to breathe properly. "How many of these pills do you have to take a day?" asked Richard. "4," replied Mrs. Margaret. "In the morning, at lunchtime, late afternoon, and before bed." "And how much do these medications cost?" $200 a month, answered Mike. "That's almost half of her pension." Richard closed his eyes, trying to process the information. $200 was less than what he spent on a single meal at fancy restaurants. To him, it was a trivial amount, but for Mrs. Margaret, it meant the difference between having money for food or for medicine. "How are you paying for these medications?" Richard asked. "Mike has been helping me," Mrs. Margaret replied. "He and Christine split the expenses with me." Richard looked at Mike with a mix of gratitude and shame. A workshop employee was spending his own money to keep his mother alive, while he, with unlimited resources, hadn't even known she existed. "How much do you spend each month taking care of her?" Richard asked. Mike hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "That doesn't matter, Mr. Anderson," he said. "We're not doing this for money." "I know it's not for money," Richard replied, "but I want to know, how much do you spend?" "Between medications, special food, private doctor visits when the pain gets too bad, about $800 a month," Mike admitted. $800 a month. Richard spent more than that on a single trip to the mall, and here was a humble man with 2 small children and a wife to support, taking food from his own family's mouths to care for a stranger who had become his moral responsibility. "Why are you telling me all this?" Richard asked. "You could have just come here asking for money for the surgery without all these explanations." "Because I don't just want your money, Mr. Anderson," Mike replied. "I want you to have the chance to meet your mother for real before it's too late. You can donate money to anyone, but time with family never comes back." Mike's words hit Richard like a slap. He realized he had spent 40 years building a brilliant professional life, but had completely neglected personal relationships. He had no family, no close friends, no one who cared about him beyond his financial usefulness. "What if I pay for the surgery?" Richard asked. "What happens afterward? She gets better and goes back to her life with the other family, pretending I don't exist?" "That depends on you," replied Mrs. Margaret, who had recovered a bit after taking her medication. "I can't force you to accept me into your life, Richard. I know I caused you a lot of pain by leaving you as a child, even if it was out of necessity." "And your other children?" Richard asked. "What happens when they find out they have an older brother they never knew?" "I'll tell them the truth," Mrs. Margaret promised. "No matter what happens here today, I can't keep living a lie. They deserve to know they have a brother, and you deserve to know you have a family." Richard walked back to the window, trying to sort through his thoughts. Outside, life went on as usual. Cars passing, people walking on the sidewalks, the world turning without a care for the personal drama unfolding in that office. "I need time to process all this," Richard finally said. 40 years of resentment don't disappear in one conversation." "I understand," Mrs. Margaret replied, "and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just wanted you to know the truth, to understand that I never stopped loving you, even when I was far away." "About the surgery," said Richard, turning to face them both. "I'll pay for it. But not because I've forgiven everything, and not because I'm accepting you back into my life. I'll pay because it's the right thing to do, and because Mike is right when he says you don't deserve to pay with your life for past mistakes." Mrs. Margaret began to cry again, but this time they were tears of relief. "Thank you, my son," she whispered. "You don't know what this means to me." "But I have conditions," Richard continued. "First, you'll tell the truth to your other children. I won't be a dirty secret in your life. Second, if the surgery is successful and you recover, we'll have honest conversations about the past. I want to understand everything that happened, with no omissions." "I accept all your conditions," Mrs. Margaret said promptly. "And Mike," Richard said, turning to the mechanic, "I want you to be responsible for coordinating her entire treatment. You know the situation better than anyone, and she trusts you. I'll give an extra amount to cover all costs and your time dedicated to this." "Mr. Richard, I don't need money to take care of her," Mike protested. "I know you don't," Richard replied. "But I insist. You took on a responsibility that was mine, and you did it out of pure kindness. It's the least I can do to repay you." Mike looked at Mrs. Margaret, who nodded. encouraging him to accept the offer. "All right," Mike finally said. "But I want to make it clear that this doesn't change my motivation. I'll keep taking care of her, because I care about her, not out of professional obligation." "I know that," Richard answered, "and that's exactly why I trust you to do it." Richard walked back to his desk and picked up the phone. "I'll call the best cardiologist in New York City," he said. "We'll schedule the surgery for next week at the best hospitals in the city." While Richard made the calls, Mike approached Mrs. Margaret. "Are you feeling better?" he asked softly. "Much better," she replied, a faint smile on her face. "Not just physically, but emotionally too. I was preparing to leave without ever speaking to my son again. Now at least he knows I exist." "He'll need time to process everything," Mike said, "but I think deep down he still loves you. I could see it in his eyes when you sang that song." "I hope you're right," Mrs. Margaret said, "but even if he never fully forgives me, at least now he knows the truth. And thanks to you, I'll have the chance to live long enough to meet any grandchildren I might have in the future." Richard hung up the phone and turned to them. "It's scheduled," he announced. "Surgery next Thursday at HeartCare Medical Center. Dr. Richards is the best cardiologist in Latin America. He'll do all the pre-op tests tomorrow." "That soon?" Mrs. Margaret asked, surprised. "When you have money, things move faster," Richard replied, with a hint of bitterness. "It's an unfair reality, but it's the reality." "Mr. Richard," Mike said, "I wanted to thank you personally for what you're doing. Mrs. Margaret means a lot to me and my family, and seeing her suffer has been very hard." "You don't have to thank me, Mike," Richard answered. "In fact, I should be the one thanking you. In 3 months, you did what I should have done for 40 years. You took care of my mother when I didn't even know she needed help." "You didn't know she existed," Mike said. "It's not your fault." "Maybe not entirely my fault," Richard agreed. "But I could have done more to find her. I could have investigated the past, could have questioned the stories they told me. Instead, I chose to believe the easiest version, the one that allowed me to be the victim." The conversation was interrupted by Richard's secretary, who knocked on the door and entered the office. "Mr. Anderson, I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there are some people from the meeting waiting in the hallway. They want to know if they should reschedule this afternoon's appointments." Richard looked at his watch and realized it was already midday. He had spent hours talking with Mrs. Margaret and Mike, completely forgetting about his packed schedule. "Reschedule everything for tomorrow, Amanda," he said, "and cancel Thursday's appointments too. I'll be at the hospital." "The hospital, sir?" Amanda asked, concerned. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," Richard replied. "It's my mother who's having surgery." Amanda looked confused, as she had never heard Richard mention his mother in all the years she had worked as his secretary. "Your mother, sir?" she asked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "It's a long story, Amanda," Richard said. "I'll explain later. For now, just reschedule the appointments and ask the driver to prepare the car. I'm taking Mrs. Margaret home." After Amanda left, Richard turned to Mike. "Where do you live?" he asked. "In Queens," Mike replied. "It's a bit far from here, sir." "That's no problem," Richard said. "I'll take you home and take the chance to see where my mother has been living." The drive to Queens took nearly an hour in New York City's heavy traffic. Richard had never been to that part of the city before and was shocked by the contrast between his luxurious world and the reality of the outskirts. The streets were narrow and poorly paved, the houses small and cramped together, and the air carried a different scent, a mix of home cooking and urban pollution. Richard's private driver seemed uncomfortable navigating those streets, clearly out of his usual element. The imported car drew attention, and some people stopped to curiously watch the luxury vehicle that stood out so sharply from its surroundings. "It's here," Mike said, pointing to a small but well-kept house. "It's not much, but it's our home." Richard got out of the car and helped Mike lift Mrs. Margaret from her wheelchair. She looked exhausted after the emotionally intense day, but insisted on showing Richard where she had been living. Mike's house was simple, but clean and tidy. The living room was small, with old but well-maintained furniture. Family photos hung on the walls, Mike, his wife Christine, and their 2 young children. It was a humble home, but full of love and care. "Christine," Mike called, "we're here." A young woman appeared in the living room, drying her hands on a dish towel. She seemed surprised to see Richard, clearly recognizing him as her husband's boss. "Christine, this is Mr. Anderson," Mike said, "Mrs. Margaret's son." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Anderson," Christine said, timidly extending her hand. "Mike told me everything about the situation. I hope Mrs. Margaret's surgery goes well." "Thank you, Christine," Richard replied. "And thank you for taking care of my mother. Mike told me you've been a great help." "Mrs. Margaret is like a grandmother to our kids," Christine said. "She always has stories to tell, always helps with homework when she's feeling well. It's a joy having her here." Mike led Richard to the small room at the back of the house where Mrs. Margaret had been staying. It was a tiny space with a single bed, an old wardrobe and a small table by the window. On the table was the cardboard box Mike had mentioned, filled with newspaper clippings about Richard. "Can I see?" asked Richard, pointing to the box. "Of course, my son," replied Mrs. Margaret. Richard opened the box and found hundreds of carefully cut and organized clippings. There were articles about his business achievements, photos of him at social events, even small notes about his statements in specialized newspapers. It was as if Mrs. Margaret had tried to keep up with every public moment of his life. "You saved all this?" asked Richard, moved. "Every article I could find," confirmed Mrs. Margaret. "I bought used newspapers at the second-hand store, asked neighbors to give me their old magazines. Whenever I saw your name or your photo, I cut it out and saved it." Richard found a special clipping, a photo of him at his college graduation. On the margin of the paper, someone had written in shaky handwriting, "My son, the doctor." "You wrote this?" asked Richard, showing the clipping. "I did," confirmed Mrs. Margaret, with tears in her eyes. "It was the happiest day of my life. I was there, you know, at the graduation, sitting at the back of the auditorium, watching you receive your diploma. You looked so handsome, so elegant." "You were at my graduation?" asked Richard, incredulous. "I didn't miss any important date of yours that was in the newspaper," said Mrs. Margaret. "Your graduation, the opening of your first store, your wedding. You were at my wedding too?" asked Richard, increasingly amazed. "Outside the church," admitted Mrs. Margaret. "I didn't go in, of course, but I stood on the sidewalk to see you come out with your wife. You looked so happy that day." Richard remembered his wedding 5 years ago. It had been a lavish ceremony at one of the most important churches in New York City, with hundreds of prominent guests. The marriage had lasted only 2 years, ending in an amicable divorce when they both realized they were incompatible. But on the day of the ceremony, he had truly felt happy. "Why did you never try to come in?" asked Richard. "Why did you always stay outside?" "Because I didn't want to ruin your special moments," replied Mrs. Margaret. "I just wanted to see you happy, even if from afar. If I suddenly showed up, it might have been awkward, might have made you feel bad on your wedding day." Richard kept rummaging through the box and found something that left him speechless. At the bottom, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was a tiny baby shoe, yellowed with age. "What's this?" he asked, holding the shoe. "It's your first shoe," said Mrs. Margaret, smiling through her tears. "You were 6 months old when you learned to stand on your own. I bought this little shoe on sale. It was the most expensive thing I could afford for you at the time. And you kept it all these years?" "I took it with me when I left home," explained Mrs. Margaret. "It was the only thing of yours I could take. All these years away from you, whenever I felt too sad, I'd hold this little shoe and remember how tiny you were, how you'd smile when I tickled your little feet." Richard held the shoe with both hands, trying to picture himself as a small baby wearing that tiny footwear. It was hard to reconcile the image of a successful businessman with that of a small child who needed care and a mother's love. "Mrs. Margaret is tired," said Christine, appearing at the bedroom door. "Maybe it's best for her to rest a bit before dinner." "Of course," agreed Richard. "I should get going anyway." "Don't you want to have dinner with us?" asked Mike. Christine made a delicious lasagna. It's not fancy food, but it's made with love. Richard hesitated. He usually dined at expensive restaurants or ordered gourmet meals delivered to his home. The idea of eating a home-cooked meal, seated at the table of a simple family, was completely outside his comfort zone. "I don't want to intrude," said Richard. "You're not intruding," insisted Christine. It would be an honor to have you at our table. Stay, son, Mrs. Margaret urged. It's been so long since I've had dinner with family. Richard looked at his mother and saw a silent plea in her eyes. He realized that regardless of all the issues between them, she truly wanted him to stay. All right, Richard agreed. I'll stay for dinner. The kitchen table was small and only fit 4 people. Mike brought a chair from the living room for Richard to sit, while Christine served lasagna on simple but clean plates. The children, 2 boys aged 6 and 8, stared at Richard with curiosity, clearly impressed by his elegant clothes. Dad said you're his boss, said the younger one, Luke. That's true, Richard confirmed. Your father works at my company. Are you rich? Asked the older one, Peter, with the typical honesty of children. Peter, Christine scolded, embarrassed. You don't ask people that. It's fine, Richard said, smiling. Yes, Peter, I have money. But you know what I realized today, that having money isn't the most important thing in the world. What's more important then? Asked Luke. Richard looked around the table, Mike and Christine exchanging affectionate glances, the children asking innocent questions, Mrs. Margaret smiling for the first time in a long while. It was a simple scene, but there was something there that all his money had never been able to buy. Family, Richard answered. Having people who care about you is more important than any amount of money. During dinner, Richard listened to stories about the family's life. Mike shared how he had met Christine at trade school, how they had dated for 5 years before marrying, how they had struggled to buy their home. Christine talked about her work as a hairstylist at a local salon, about her dreams of one day owning her own business. The children told him about school, their friends and the cartoons they loved to watch. Mrs. Margaret joined the conversation, asking about the boys' homework, praising Christine's cooking, laughing at the family's innocent jokes. It was a world completely different from Richard's, where conversations revolved around profits, investments, and business strategies. Here, people talked about simple but important things, health, happiness, small but achievable dreams. Mrs. Margaret helps us so much with the kids, Christine shared. She has endless patience for helping with homework, and she knows old stories the boys love to hear. What kind of stories? Richard asked. Stories from when she was young, Peter answered. She tells us what life was like back then, when there was no internet or video games. And she makes the best chamomile tea in the world, Luke added. When we have a stomachache, she makes the tea, and we feel better right away. Richard watched his mother interacting with the children and saw a side of her he didn't know. She was affectionate, patient, attentive. It was hard to reconcile that image with the woman who had left a young child to work far from home. After dinner, Mike took Richard to the small backyard behind the house. It was a simple space with a few plants and a small laundry area, but it was well kept and tidy. Thank you for staying for dinner, Mike said. It meant a lot to Mrs. Margaret and to us too. I should be the one thanking you, Richard replied. It's been a long time since I've had a family meal. In fact, I don't think I've ever had a real family meal before. You've never been married? Asked Mike. I was for 2 years, replied Richard, but our relationship was more of a partnership than a marriage. We rarely had dinner together, and when we did, it was always about work or social commitments. And kids? Did you never want to have children? Richard hesitated before answering. I always thought I wasn't cut out to be a father, he admitted. I grew up without a functional family model, never knowing how family relationships should be. I thought it would be better not to risk ruining a child's life. Maybe it's not too late to learn, suggested Mike. Mrs. Margaret could teach you a lot about family if you two can work through the issues from the past. Do you really think it's possible to rebuild a relationship after 40 years? Asked Richard. I think it's worth trying, replied Mike. You've both lost a lot of time, but you still have plenty ahead, especially if the surgery goes well and Mrs. Margaret recovers. And if it doesn't? Asked Richard, voicing the fear he'd been trying to hide. What if I lose her again right after finding her? Then at least you'll have had the chance to say a proper goodbye, answered Mike, and at least she'll know you didn't completely forget her. When they went back inside the house, Mrs. Margaret was sitting in the living room, helping Luke with a drawing. She held the colored pencil with shaky hands, but managed to make delicate strokes on the paper. "What are you drawing?" asked Richard, approaching. "A family," replied Luke. "Mrs. Margaret is teaching me how to draw people." Richard looked at the drawing and saw simple figures representing adults and children holding hands. In the center of the paper, Luke had drawn a white-haired lady, surrounded by smaller figures. "Who are these people in the drawing?" asked Richard. "That's Mrs. Margaret in the middle," explained Luke. "And these are all the people who love her. Me, Peter, Dad, Mom, and this one here is you." Richard looked closer and saw that Luke had drawn a tall male figure next to the one representing Mrs. Margaret. It was a childlike, disproportionate drawing, but there was something touching about its simplicity. "Why did you put me in the drawing?" asked Richard. "Because Mrs. Margaret said you're her son," replied Luke as if it were obvious, "and sons have to stay close to their mums in the drawing." The innocence of Luke's observation struck Richard deeply. To the child, it was simple. Mothers and sons should be together, no matter the complications or problems from the past. "Can I keep this drawing?" asked Richard. "Of course," replied Luke, smiling. "I can make another one just like it for Mrs. Margaret." Richard carefully folded the drawing and placed it in his jacket pocket. It was the first time in decades someone had included him in a representation of family, even if it was just a child's innocent drawing. "I think it's time for me to go," said Richard, checking his watch. "Tomorrow we have to go to the hospital for the pre-op tests." "What time should we be ready?" asked Mike. "I'll send my driver to pick you up at 7 in the morning," replied Richard. "The tests are scheduled for 8. "That early?" asked Mrs. Margaret, concerned. "Dr. Richard said it's best to do all the tests at once," explained Richard. "It'll be a long day, but at least by Thursday we'll be ready for the surgery." Mrs. Margaret stood up from the chair with Mike's help and walked over to Richard. "Thank you for everything, my son," she said, hesitating for a moment before opening her arms. Richard hesitated too, but then stepped forward and gave his mother a quick, awkward hug. It was the first time they had touched in 40 years, and neither seemed quite sure how to act. "See you tomorrow," said Richard, heading for the door. "Richard," called Mrs. Margaret, stopping him. "I know we still have a lot to talk about, so much to clear up, but I want you to know you've become exactly the man I dreamed you'd be when you were little. You're successful, intelligent, and today I discovered you also have a good heart." "Thank you," Richard replied, unsure what else to say. The ride back to Richard's apartment was silent. He watched the city lights pass by the car window, trying to process everything that had happened that day. His life had completely changed in just a few hours, and he wasn't sure how to handle all the conflicting emotions he was feeling. When he got home, Richard went straight to his private office. It was a luxurious space, with imported furniture and a spectacular view of the city. The walls were lined with diplomas, certificates, and photos of him with important business figures. He sat in his leather armchair and pulled out Luke's drawing from his pocket. He looked at the simple figures colored in crayon, so different from all the expensive artwork decorating his home. But there was something about the child's drawing that was more valuable than any painting he owned. Richard opened his desk drawer and carefully tucked the drawing among his important documents. It was a symbol of something he had lost long ago and might now have a chance to regain: the ability to be part of a real family. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Amanda, his assistant. "Mr. Anderson, I'm sorry to call so late," she said, "but some important clients are asking about the appointments cancelled today. They want to reschedule for tomorrow." "Tomorrow will be difficult too, Amanda," Richard replied. "I'll be at the hospital with my mother." "Your mother, sir?" Amanda asked, still confused. "I didn't know you had family." "Neither did I," Richard admitted, realizing how strange that sounded. "It's a complicated situation I'll explain later. For now, reschedule everything for Friday." "May I ask if your mother is all right?" Amanda asked, genuinely concerned. "She's having heart surgery," Richard explained. "It's delicate, but the doctor said the odds are good." "I'm so sorry, Mr. Anderson," Amanda said. "If you need anything at all, you can count on me." "Thank you, Amanda," Richard replied, surprised by his assistant's sincerity. After hanging up, Richard thought about Amanda's reaction. In 5 years of working for him, she had never shown personal concern for his life, but just mentioning his sick mother had prompted genuine offers of help. It made him reflect on how he had built his professional life. He had always kept a cold, professional distance from his employees, never sharing anything about his personal life. Not because he was a bad person, but because he had simply never learned how to form real human connections. The next morning, Richard woke earlier than usual. He had spent the night thinking about Mrs. Margaret's surgery, worried about possible complications. He didn't want to admit it to himself, but he was afraid of losing his mother so soon after finding her again. At 7 sharp, his driver was at Mike's door. Mrs. Margaret seemed nervous but determined, wearing her best outfit for the occasion. Mike carried a bag with her medical documents and medications. "How did you sleep?" Richard asked as soon as they got into the car. "Not very well," admitted Mrs. Margaret. "I kept thinking about the surgery, about how it will be. It's been so long since I've had a full medical checkup." "Dr. Richards is the best in his field," assured Richard. "He's performed thousands of surgeries like yours. You're in the best possible hands." The HeartCare Medical Center was one of the most modern and luxurious medical institutions in New York City. When they arrived, Richard was greeted with the deference reserved for VIP patients. A nurse escorted them directly to Dr. Richards' office, bypassing the general waiting area. Dr. Richards was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a confident demeanor that inspired trust. He greeted Richard warmly, clearly familiar with his business reputation. "Mr. Anderson, it's an honor to have you here," said Dr. Richards. "And this must be your mother." "Yes, doctor," Richard replied. "This is Mrs. Margaret, my mother." Dr. Richards turned to Mrs. Margaret with a kind, professional smile. "Mrs. Margaret, we'll take excellent care of you," he said. "First, we'll run all the necessary tests to assess your current condition, and then we'll discuss the procedure." The tests took the entire morning. Mrs. Margaret underwent an electrocardiogram, echocardiogram, chest X-ray, blood work, and several other exams. Richard and Mike stayed in the VIP waiting room, drinking coffee and trying to make small talk to mask their anxiety. "Are you nervous?" Mike asked. "Very," Richard admitted. "I didn't expect to feel this way. I thought I could keep my professional composure, but it's different when it's family." "It's normal to be nervous," Mike said. "Even with all the issues between you, she's still your mother." "You're right," Richard agreed. "And no matter how much I try to deny it, I still care about her. Maybe I always have, but I was too hurt to admit it." By late afternoon, Dr. Richards called the three of them to discuss the test results. His expression was serious but not alarming. "Well, as we expected, Mrs. Margaret has severe mitral valve insufficiency," the doctor explained. "The heart valve isn't closing properly, which forces the heart to work harder than it should." "Is it serious?" Richard asked. "It's a significant condition, but entirely operable," Dr. Richards replied. "We'll perform surgery to repair the valve. It's a procedure we do regularly, with a high success rate." "What exactly is the success rate?" Richard pressed, wanting precise information. "For patients of Mrs. Margaret's age, in similar conditions, we have a success rate of approximately 95%, Dr. Richards answered. "The remaining 5% usually involves age-related complications or other health conditions." "And how long is the recovery?" Mike asked. "If all goes well, Mrs. Margaret will be hospitalized for about a week," Dr. Richards explained. "After that, she'll need rest at home for another 4 to 6 weeks, with regular medical follow-ups." Mrs. Margaret, who had remained quiet during the medical explanation, finally spoke. "Doctor, I want to be honest with you," she said. "I can't afford this surgery. It's my son who's covering everything." Dr. Richards glanced at Richard, who nodded in confirmation. "That's not a problem at all, Mrs. Margaret," Dr. Richards said. "What matters is that you receive the best possible care. We'll take care of you as if you were our own family." "And the risks?" Mrs. Margaret asked. "I want the truth, doctor. At my age, there are always risks." Dr. Richards hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing how much truth to share. "Every surgical procedure carries risks, Mrs. Margaret," he finally said. "In your case, the main risks are related to anesthesia and the possibility of cardiac complications during surgery, but your overall health condition is reasonably good for your age, which significantly reduces these risks." "Doctor," said Richard. "I want you to be completely honest with us. What are the real chances of something going wrong?" Dr. Richards looked directly at Richard before answering. "If you press me for a frank answer, I'd say there's approximately a 1 in 20 chance of serious complications," he said, "and a 1 in 50 chance of irreversible consequences." The euphemism was clear to everyone in the room. Mrs. Margaret had a 1 in 50 chance of not surviving the surgery. "And if I don't have the surgery?" asked Mrs. Margaret. "Without surgery, based on the current progression of your condition, you'd likely have between 3 to 6 months, replied Dr. Richards, gently but honestly. A heavy silence filled the room. Everyone was processing the information. Having the surgery offered an excellent chance of full recovery, but also carried a small yet real risk of fatal consequences. Not having the surgery was a sentence of just a few months to live. "I want to have the surgery," said Mrs. Margaret, her voice firm and resolute. "I'd rather take the risk trying to heal than accept a situation with no way out." "Are you sure, Mom?" asked Richard, surprised at how naturally the word Mom had come out. "I'm sure, my son," replied Mrs. Margaret, smiling as she heard Richard call her Mom. "I still have so much to live for. I want to meet my other children. I want to fully reconcile with you. I want to see if you'll give me grandchildren someday." "Then it's settled," said Dr. Richards. "Surgery on Thursday at 7 in the morning. Mrs. Margaret needs to arrive at the hospital on Wednesday night for final preparations." When they left the hospital, the sun was setting over New York City. The streets were packed with rush-hour traffic, but inside the car, there was a contemplative silence. Each was lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. "Do you want to go out for dinner tonight?" Richard suddenly asked. "There's a restaurant I go to with really home-style food. It's nothing fancy, but the food is good." "You don't have to trouble yourself," said Mike. "It's no trouble," Richard insisted. "Actually, I'd like your company, and Mrs. Margaret needs to eat well before the surgery." Richard took them to a traditional Brazilian restaurant in the city center. It was a place he used to frequent early in his career, when he couldn't afford upscale restaurants. The food was simple but flavorful, and the atmosphere was cozy. During dinner, Mrs. Margaret shared more stories about Richard's childhood, details he had forgotten or never known. She remembered his first words, his childhood mischief, his fears and joys. "You were such a smart child," Mrs. Margaret said, "always asking questions about everything, always wanting to understand how things worked. Your grandmother Rose used to say you'd become a doctor or an engineer when you grew up." "And I became a businessman," said Richard. "Did I disappoint expectations?" "You became a successful man, and more importantly, a good man," replied Mrs. Margaret. "How could I be disappointed?" Mike watched the interaction between mother and son with satisfaction. He could see the barriers between them gradually lowering, both allowing themselves to feel the affection that had been suppressed for decades. "Mrs. Margaret," said Mike, "have you thought about how you'll tell Paul and Melissa about Richard?" "I've been thinking about it constantly," admitted Mrs. Margaret. "It won't be easy to explain why I kept this a secret for so many years." "They'll understand," said Richard. "I hope they do, and I'd really like to meet them if they'll have me." "They're good people," said Mrs. Margaret. "Paul is a history teacher, married, with a young daughter. Melissa is a nurse, still single, always taking care of everyone. They'll like you, I'm sure." "What if they're angry with you for lying all this time?" asked Richard, concerned. "Then I'll have to face the consequences," Mrs. Margaret replied. "But I can't keep living a lie. You three deserve to know each other." After dinner, Richard drove Mrs. Margaret and Mike back home. Before saying goodbye, he hesitated for a moment at the door. "Tomorrow's Wednesday," he said. "Would you like me to spend the day with you, before we go to the hospital in the evening?" "Don't you have work?" asked Mike. "Work can wait," Richard replied. "Some things are more important than business." "I'd love for you to spend the day with us," said Mrs. Margaret, her eyes shining with joy. "Then it's settled," Richard said. "I'll be here at 9 in the morning." On Wednesday, Richard woke with a strange feeling. For the first time in years, he wasn't anxious to go to work, wasn't thinking about meetings or contracts. His mind was entirely focused on the family he was rediscovering. He arrived at Mike's house right at 9, bringing fresh bread from a French bakery he used to frequent. Christine prepared a special breakfast, and the whole family gathered around the kitchen table. "What are our plans for today?" Richard asked. Mrs. Margaret wanted to show you some places that are important to her, Mike said, if you don't mind walking around the neighborhood a bit. Of course, Richard agreed. I'd love to learn more about the life you've built here. After breakfast, they set out for a walk through the neighborhood. Mrs. Margaret, despite her frailty, insisted on walking instead of using the wheelchair. She wanted to show Richard where she shopped, where she made friends, where she had built a small life in Queens. This is the pharmacy where I get my medicine, she said, pointing to a small but well-kept shop. The pharmacist, Mr. Jack, always treats me so kindly. Sometimes he even gives me a discount when I'm short on money. And over there is the health clinic she goes to when she's not feeling well, Mike added. Dr. Faith knows her case well. They passed by the church where Mike had found Mrs. Margaret after she fainted, the little grocery store where she shopped, the park where she sometimes sat to chat with other ladies from the neighborhood. It was a microcosm of simple life, rich in human connections. How different from my life, Richard remarked. I live in a neighborhood where I don't even know my neighbors' names. Here, everyone knows each other, said Mrs. Margaret. It has its pros and cons. Everyone knows everyone's business, but they also help when someone's in need. They stopped at a small diner where Mrs. Margaret occasionally had a snack. The owner, Mr. Anthony, greeted her warmly. Mrs. Margaret, Mr. Anthony exclaimed. How are you? I heard you're having surgery. Yes, Mr. Anthony, Mrs. Margaret replied. This is my son, Richard. Your son? Mr. Anthony asked, surprised. You never told me you had a son. It's a long story, Mrs. Margaret said, smiling. But now we've found each other again. Mr. Anthony greeted Richard warmly and insisted on serving sandwiches for everyone. While preparing the snack, he told how Mrs. Margaret had always been kind to everyone, always helping the neighbors when she could. Your mother is a special person, Mr. Anthony said to Richard. Whenever someone is going through a hard time, she shows up with a comforting word or practical help. How so? Richard asked. Last week, Mrs. Mary's daughter had a high fever, Mr. Anthony explained. Mrs. Margaret stayed up all night, caring for the child so the mother could rest, and she did it even though she was sick herself. Richard looked at his mother with new appreciation. Even while dealing with her own health struggles, even living with limited means, she kept taking care of others. Why do you do this? Richard asked as they left the diner. Why worry so much about others when you're the one who needs care? Because that's how I was raised, Mrs. Margaret replied. My mother taught me that life gets lighter when we share each other's burdens, and when you help someone, you always get help in return when you need it. That's how I met Mrs. Margaret, Mike confirmed. She was helping a neighbor care for a sick grandchild when she fainted outside the church. Even while feeling unwell, she was looking after someone else. Later that afternoon, they returned to Mike's house. Mrs. Margaret was visibly tired from the walk, but seemed happy to have shared her world with Richard. I need to pack for the hospital, she said. What kind of things do you need to bring? Richard asked. Clothes to change into, toiletries, my medications, Mrs. Margaret replied. It's not much. Richard watched as she packed and noticed how few and simple her belongings were. 2 changes of clothes, a worn toothbrush, an old comb, generic medicine bottles. It was all she owned in the world. Mom, Richard said, the word coming more naturally now. After the surgery, once you've recovered, would you like to live somewhere more comfortable? What do you mean? Mrs. Margaret asked. I could buy you a better home, Richard explained. A bigger place, more comfortable, in a nicer neighborhood. Mrs. Margaret stopped packing and looked at him seriously. Richard, I appreciate the offer, but I don't want you to feel like you have to support me. I didn't come back into your life to be a financial burden. You wouldn't be a burden, Richard insisted. It would be a pleasure to take care of you, to make up for lost time. I'll think about it, Mrs. Margaret said diplomatically. First, let's see how the surgery goes. At 5 in the evening, they left for the Heart Care Medical Center. Mrs. Margaret was scheduled to be admitted at 6 for final preparations before the next day's surgery. During the ride, she seemed thoughtful and a little anxious. Are you scared? Richard asked. A little, Mrs. Margaret admitted. Not about the procedure itself, but about what comes after. How so? What if something goes wrong? She asked. What if I never get the chance to tell the truth to Paul and Melissa? What if our reconciliation stays unfinished? Richard took his mother's hand. surprising himself with his own courage to make such an intimate gesture. "Nothing will go wrong," he said with more confidence than he felt. "And our reconciliation isn't unfinished. I've already forgiven you, Mum, and I hope you'll forgive me for holding on to so much resentment all these years." "There's nothing to forgive, my son," Mrs. Margaret replied, squeezing his hand. "You were a child who felt abandoned. Your anger was justified." The hospital admission process was smooth and efficient. Mrs. Margaret was taken to a private room, comfortable and well-equipped. Richard had made sure she would receive the best possible care. "You can stay here until 9 in the evening," the nurse explained. "Tomorrow the surgery is scheduled for 7 in the morning, so Mrs. Margaret needs to rest well." Mike said goodbye to Mrs. Margaret around 8, promising to return the next day for the surgery. For the first time since their reunion, Richard was alone with his mother. "How are you feeling?" Richard asked. "Nervous but hopeful," Mrs. Margaret replied. "It's been a long time since I've felt hopeful about the future." "I'm hopeful too," Richard admitted. "For the first time in years, I feel like I have something personally important in my life, beyond work." They talked about plans for the future, about Mrs. Margaret's recovery, and the possibility of her meeting the grandchildren Richard might have one day. Their conversation blended hope with uncertainty, but it carried a warmth that had been missing from both their lives for decades. "Richard," Mrs. Margaret said, as it was almost time for him to leave, "I want you to know these last few days have been the happiest I've had in a very long time. No matter what happens tomorrow, I'm grateful for the chance to know the extraordinary man you've become." "I'm grateful too," Richard replied, "and tomorrow will go well. You'll recover, you'll meet your grandchildren, and we'll have plenty of time to keep talking." When Richard left the hospital, it was already dark. He drove home slowly, dreading the empty apartment where he'd spend the night worrying about the surgery. At home, Richard tried to distract himself with work but couldn't focus. He picked up Luke's drawing and stared at the simple figures representing a united family. That was what he wanted now. A real family, genuine human connections, people who cared for each other. The phone rang around 10 at night. It was Mike. "Mr. Anderson, sorry to call so late," Mike said. "I just wanted to know how Mrs. Margaret was when you left the hospital." "She was fine," Richard replied. "Nervous but determined. And thank you for asking, Mike. It means a lot to know others care about her." "Mrs. Margaret has become part of our family," Mike said. "We're all rooting for everything to go well tomorrow." "It will," Richard said, trying to convince himself as much as Mike. After hanging up, Richard tried to sleep but spent most of the night awake, thinking about the surgery and all the possible outcomes. He realized he was more nervous than he'd ever been during any major negotiation in his career. At 5 in the morning, Richard gave up on sleep and headed to the hospital. He wanted to be there when Mrs. Margaret woke up, to let her know she wasn't alone. When he arrived at her room, Mrs. Margaret was already awake, speaking softly with the nurse preparing her for surgery. "You're here early," Mrs. Margaret said, smiling at Richard. "I couldn't sleep," Richard admitted. "I wanted to be here with you." The nurse explained they'd soon take Mrs. Margaret to the operating room, where she'd be prepped for anesthesia. The procedure would take about 4 hours, and family could follow updates on her progress. "I have something for you," Mrs. Margaret said, pulling something from her nightgown pocket. It was a small, very old and worn photo of a little boy playing in a backyard. "That's you at 3 years old," Mrs. Margaret explained. "It's the photo I've always carried with me all these years away from you." Richard picked up the photo carefully, as if it were a fragile and precious object. "You carried this for 40 years?" he asked, moved. "Always," confirmed Mrs. Margaret. "When I felt very alone, I'd look at this photo and remember that somewhere out there, I had a son who might still think of me." "I always thought of you," admitted Richard, "even when I was angry, even when I tried to convince myself I didn't care." Mike Johnson arrived just before 7, accompanied by Christine and their 2 children. Luke brought another drawing for Mrs. Margaret, this one showing her smiling in a hospital bed with a nurse by her side. "This is for you to take into surgery," said Luke, "to remind you that everyone is rooting for you." "Thank you, my angel," said Mrs. Margaret, kissing the boy's forehead. "I'll keep this drawing close to my heart." Dr. Richards appeared in the room at 7 sharp, wearing his surgical scrubs and with a confident expression. "Good morning, Mrs. Margaret," he said. "Are you ready for our heart-to-heart talk?" "I'm ready, Doctor," replied Mrs. Margaret. "You can take care of me." "We'll take very good care of you," promised Dr. Richards. "And when you wake up, you'll have a brand new heart working perfectly." The hospital staff arrived with a gurney to take Mrs. Margaret to the operating room. It was time for a temporary goodbye, but everyone knew there was a small chance it could be permanent. "See you in a few hours," said Richard, kissing his mother's forehead. "I love you, my son," whispered Mrs. Margaret, "and thank you for giving me a second chance." "I love you too, Mom," Richard replied, the words coming straight from his heart without hesitation. As they wheeled Mrs. Margaret away for surgery, Richard felt strangely empty. It was as if an important part of his life was being taken away, and he had no control over whether it would return. The hospital waiting room was luxurious and comfortable, but Richard couldn't settle. He paced back and forth, checked the clock constantly, tried to read magazines but couldn't focus. Mike and Christine stayed with him the whole time, offering moral support and company. The children played quietly, instinctively sensing it was a serious moment. "The first hour is always the hardest," said Christine. "Once they send the first update, it gets easier to relax." At 8:30, Dr. Richards sent a message through the nurse. The surgery was progressing well, Mrs. Margaret had responded well to anesthesia, and they were beginning the valve repair. "Is that a good sign?" asked Richard. "It's a great sign," replied the nurse. "If there are problems with anesthesia, they show up early. The fact that everything's fine means the biggest risk is already past." By 10 o'clock, the second update arrived. The valve repair was successful. Mrs. Margaret's vitals were stable, and they estimated 2 more hours to complete the procedure. Richard began to feel more optimistic. Maybe his mother really would survive the surgery. Maybe they'd truly have the chance to build a real family relationship. During the wait, Mike shared more stories about Mrs. Margaret, how she'd adapted to life in Queens, the friendships she'd made, and the people she'd helped. "She has a natural gift for caring for others," said Mike. "Even when she was sick, she always found the energy to help her neighbors." "Where do you think that generosity comes from?" asked Richard. "I think it comes from suffering," replied Mike. "Those who've suffered deeply recognize others' pain and feel the need to help." At 11:30, Dr. Richards appeared in the waiting room in person. He was still wearing his surgical scrubs, but had removed his mask and was smiling. "How did it go?" asked Richard, standing up immediately. "It went perfectly," replied Dr. Richards. "The surgery was a complete success. We managed to repair the valve without complications, and Mrs. Margaret responded exceptionally well to the entire procedure." Richard felt his legs go weak with relief. Mike and Christine hugged, and the children celebrated quietly. "When can we see her?" asked Richard. "She's being taken to recovery now," explained Dr. Richards. "She'll sleep for a few more hours because of the anesthesia. You can see her around 3 in the afternoon, but she'll likely only be fully conscious tomorrow morning." "And the recovery?" asked Mike. "What will that look like?" "If everything continues to go well, she'll stay hospitalized for a week," replied Dr. Richards. "After that, rest at home for another month with regular medical checkups. But the prognosis is excellent. With the valve functioning properly, Mrs. Margaret should have a much better quality of life." Richard felt as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. His mother had survived the surgery, and now they'd have the chance to rebuild their family relationship. "Doctor," said Richard, "thank you for everything. You saved my mother's life." "It was a pleasure caring for her," replied Dr. Richards. "Mrs. Margaret is a special patient, very brave and determined. Those qualities make all the difference in recovery." After Dr. Richards left, Richard sat in the waiting room and finally allowed himself to relax. Mike approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Everything worked out," said Mike, smiling. "Mrs. Margaret will be fine." "Yes," agreed Richard. "And now we have to prepare for the next phase, helping her recover and building a real family life." "Have you thought about how that will look?" asked Christine. "How will your lives work once she's out of the hospital?" "Not yet," admitted Richard. "I was so focused on the surgery that I didn't think much beyond that. But I know I want to be present in her life. I want to make up for lost time." "And her other children?" asked Mike. "When will she tell them about you?" "As soon as she's feeling better," replied Richard. "She promised she'd tell them the truth." and I want to meet them." At 3 in the afternoon, they were allowed to visit Mrs. Margaret in the recovery room. She was asleep, hooked up to several monitors, but looked peaceful and had good color in her face. "She's beautiful," whispered Christine. "She already seems better." Richard stepped closer to the bed and carefully held his mother's hand. It was warm, and her pulse was strong and steady. "Thank you for fighting," Richard whispered to Mrs. Margaret, even though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Thank you for giving our family a chance." They stayed in the recovery room for an hour, just watching Mrs. Margaret sleep and making sure she was all right. The monitors showed stable vital signs, and the nurse said everything was progressing perfectly. "Let's let her rest," Richard finally said. "We'll come back tomorrow morning when she's awake." As they left the hospital, Richard felt different. It was as if the past few days had fundamentally changed who he was. He was no longer just a successful, lonely businessman. He was a son who had reunited with his mother, a man learning the value of family ties. "Mike," Richard said when they reached the parking lot, "I want to make you an offer." "What kind of offer, Mr. Anderson?" "I want to promote you to shop manager," said Richard, "with a salary that matches the responsibility and what you've done for my family." "Mr. Richard, I didn't do anything expecting a reward," protested Mike. "I know that," replied Richard, "but you showed leadership and humanity that are rare. Besides, when my mother leaves the hospital, she'll need special care during her recovery. I want you to coordinate that, and I want to compensate you properly for your time." "If it's important to you, I accept," said Mike, "but I want to make it clear that I'll keep taking care of Mrs. Margaret because I like her, not out of professional obligation." "I know that," said Richard, "and that's exactly why I trust you." That evening, Richard dined with Mike's family again. This time the meal had a celebratory atmosphere. Mrs. Margaret had survived the surgery, and everyone was optimistic about the future. "Uncle Richard," said Luke, already addressing him familiarly, "when Mrs. Margaret comes home, will you visit her every day?" "I will," promised Richard, "and maybe she can visit my house too when she's feeling better." "Is your house very big?" asked Peter. "It's quite big," admitted Richard, "but it's also very empty. Maybe with Mrs. Margaret there, it'll feel more like a real home." Christine smiled, understanding that Richard was discovering the difference between a luxurious house and a home filled with love. "Are you thinking about starting a family of your own?" Christine asked discreetly. "For the first time in my life, I'm seriously considering it," replied Richard. "I always thought I wasn't cut out for family life, but I think I was wrong. Maybe I just needed to learn how a real family works." The next morning, Richard arrived at the hospital early, eager to see his mother awake and alert. When he entered the room, Mrs. Margaret was sitting up in bed, sipping chicken broth and chatting with the nurse. "My son," she exclaimed when she saw Richard. "You're here early. How are you feeling?" Richard asked, approaching the bed. "Much better than I expected," replied Mrs. Margaret. "My chest still hurts a little, but it's a different kind of pain. It feels like my heart is beating stronger, more steadily." "Dr. Richard said the surgery went perfectly," Richard told her. "You'll make a full recovery." "Thank God," said Mrs. Margaret. "And thank you, my son. If you hadn't paid for the surgery, I probably wouldn't be here." "Don't say that," said Richard. "You're here because you're a strong, determined woman. The surgery was just a tool." Mike arrived shortly after, bringing flowers the children had picked for Mrs. Margaret. She was touched by the gesture and insisted they be placed where she could see them from her bed. "How are your morning tests?" Mike asked. "All perfect," replied Mrs. Margaret. "The doctor said my heart is working better than it has in years." Dr. Richard stopped by in the afternoon for a follow-up visit. He examined Mrs. Margaret carefully and was very pleased with her recovery. "Mrs. Margaret, you're doing exceptionally well," said Dr. Richards. "If you keep this up, you could be discharged by the end of next week." "That soon?" Richard asked, surprised. "Modern heart surgeries allow for much faster recoveries than in the past," Dr. Richards explained. "And Mrs. Margaret is responding better than most patients her age." "And when she's home?" asked Mike. "What kind of care will she need?" "Moderate rest for 4 weeks, blood-thinning medication, light cardiac therapy and weekly checkups," listed Dr. Richards. but nothing too complicated. After that period, she should be fully recovered for a normal life. After Dr. Richards left, Mrs. Margaret took Richard's hand. "My son, now that we know I'll be fine, we need to talk about the future," she said. "What do you mean?" "I need to tell Paul and Melissa about you," said Mrs. Margaret. "I can't put off this conversation any longer." "How do you plan to do that?" asked Richard. "I want them to come visit me here at the hospital," replied Mrs. Margaret. "I'll tell them the truth, and if they want, introduce them to you." "What if they get angry?" asked Richard, worried. "Then I'll have to face the consequences," said Mrs. Margaret. "But I can't keep lying to them anymore." "When will you call them?" asked Mike. "Tomorrow," Mrs. Margaret decided. "I'll ask them to come visit me tomorrow afternoon. Then I'll tell them everything." Richard felt his nerves growing. He was about to meet his siblings, people who shared the same mother but had grown up in a completely different world. How would this first meeting go? Would they accept him? Would they resent him for having opportunities they never had? "Do you want me here when they come?" he asked. "I do," replied Mrs. Margaret, "but maybe it's better if I talk to them first alone. Afterward, if they want to meet you, I'll call you in." "Okay," Richard agreed. "I'll wait in the lobby." That night, Richard struggled to sleep again. This time it wasn't worry about his mother's health, but anxiety about meeting his siblings. He realized he'd spent his whole life feeling like an orphan, and now he'd discovered an entire family he never knew. The next day, Richard arrived at the hospital in the early afternoon. Mrs. Margaret was visibly nervous, rearranging her things on the bedside table over and over. "Are they here yet?" he asked. "Not yet," replied Mrs. Margaret, "but they should be here any minute. Paul said he'd come straight from work, and Melissa was going to pick him up on the way." "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," Mrs. Margaret admitted. "I don't know how they'll react when they find out I've lied to them their whole lives." "You didn't lie," said Richard. "You just kept a part of the truth that was too painful to share." "I hope they see it that way," said Mrs. Margaret. At 3:30, two people appeared at the door of the room. A man in his 30s, tall and thin, with glasses and an intellectual expression. A woman a few years younger, with the gentle, steady face of a nurse. "Mom," the man said, approaching the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, Paul," replied Mrs. Margaret. "Melissa, did you come straight from the hospital?" "I did," Melissa answered, kissing her mother's forehead. "I switched shifts so I could visit you." Richard watched from a distance, studying his siblings' faces. Paul resembled him in facial structure, but had a softer, less tense expression. Melissa had the same eyes as Mrs. Margaret, full of kindness and concern. "Kids," Mrs. Margaret said, taking a deep breath, "I need to talk to you about something very important." "What is it, Mom?" asked Melissa, taking Mrs. Margaret's hand. "Is everything okay with the surgery?" "The surgery went perfectly," Mrs. Margaret assured her. "But there's something about our family I've never told you, and I can't keep it a secret any longer." Paul and Melissa exchanged worried glances. "What kind of secret?" Paul asked. "You have an older brother," said Mrs. Margaret, her voice trembling slightly. "His name is Richard. He's 45, and I raised him until he was 5 before I met your father." The silence that followed was deafening. Paul took off his glasses and cleaned them nervously, while Melissa stared at her mother with complete disbelief. "What do you mean we have a brother?" Melissa finally asked. "When I was very young, I had a relationship with a man who later abandoned me," explained Mrs. Margaret. "From that relationship, Richard was born. I raised him alone until he was 5, but then I had to leave home to work and support the family. He stayed with his maternal grandmother, and we lost contact." "And where is he now?" asked Paul, his voice controlled but tense. "He's here," replied Mrs. Margaret. "In fact, he was the one who paid for my surgery." "Here? At the hospital?" asked Melissa. "In the waiting room," confirmed Mrs. Margaret. "We reunited a week ago, after 40 years apart." Paul stood up and began pacing the room, clearly trying to process the information. "Let me get this straight," he said. "Our whole lives, you kept it a secret that we had an older brother, and now he shows up out of nowhere and pays for an extremely expensive surgery." "It wasn't like that," said Mrs. Margaret, defensive. I didn't keep it secret out of malice. It was too painful to talk about him. And when you were born, I wanted you to have a normal family without the complications of the past." "Mom," said Melissa, her voice gentler than Paul's, "I understand it must have been hard, but we had the right to know we have a brother." "You're right," admitted Mrs. Margaret. "And I'm sorry for keeping it a secret, but now you know the truth." "How did he find us?" asked Paul. "How did he know you were sick?" Mrs. Margaret told the story of how Mike had found her, how he had discovered the connection with Richard, and how they had reunited. Paul and Melissa listened in silence, their expressions a mix of surprise, confusion, and curiosity. "And what's he like?" asked Melissa. "What kind of person is our brother?" "He's a good man," replied Mrs. Margaret. "Successful, intelligent, and more generous than I deserved after abandoning him as a child." "Can we meet him?" asked Melissa. Paul looked at his sister in surprise. "Melissa, don't you think this is all too fast?" he said. "A week ago, we didn't even know he existed. Now we're just supposed to accept a stranger as our brother." "Paul has a point," admitted Mrs. Margaret. "You don't have to meet him if you don't want to. I understand it's a lot to process at once." "I want to meet him," Melissa said firmly. "I've always felt like something was missing in our family. Maybe this is it." "And you, Paul?" asked Mrs. Margaret. Paul hesitated for a long moment before answering. "I'm angry, Mom," he admitted. "Not at him, but at the situation. It's not fair to find out we have a brother only now as adults. We missed the chance to grow up together, to know each other as real siblings." "I know," said Mrs. Margaret, tears in her eyes. "And I'm so sorry for that. But maybe there's still time to build a relationship, even starting now." "Fine," Paul finally said. "I'll meet him too. But I want him to know it won't be easy for me to accept all this." Mrs. Margaret let out a relieved breath. "Can I call him in?" she asked. "Go ahead," Paul and Melissa answered at the same time. Mrs. Margaret pressed the button to call the nurse and asked her to let Richard know he could come to the room. A few minutes later, Richard appeared at the door, visibly nervous. "Paul, Melissa," said Mrs. Margaret. "This is Richard, your older brother. Richard, these are Paul and Melissa, your siblings." The silence that followed was heavy with tension and expectation. The three siblings studied each other, searching for physical resemblances, imagining what it might have been like to grow up together. "Hello," Richard finally said, his voice hesitant. "Hi," Paul and Melissa replied almost simultaneously. "It's strange looking at you," Richard admitted. "I can see our mother in both of your faces." "And we can see you in hers too," said Melissa. "You have the same eyes." Paul remained more reserved, but stepped forward to greet Richard. "Thank you for taking care of our mother," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for looking after her all these years," Richard replied, shaking his brother's hand. "Sit down," suggested Mrs. Margaret. "Let's talk as a family." It was surreal for everyone to be gathered in that hospital room. Three grown children who shared the same mother but were strangers to one another. "Tell them about your life," Mrs. Margaret encouraged. Richard hesitated, not wanting to come across as boastful. "I work in the car dealership business," he said simply. "I started as a salesman and built my company over the years." "Are you married? Do you have kids?" asked Melissa. "I was married for 2 years, but it didn't work out," Richard replied. "And I don't have children. Honestly, until I met you, I thought I had no family at all." "We felt the same about you," said Melissa. "It's strange to think we had a brother and didn't know." "How was it growing up without knowing our mother?" asked Paul, his curiosity overcoming his initial reserve. "It was hard," Richard admitted. "I grew up thinking she had abandoned me by choice. Only now did I learn she was working to support us." "And you?" Richard asked. "What was it like growing up with her?" "She was a wonderful mother," Melissa answered. "Always present, always loving. She worked hard to give us a good education." "Sometimes she'd get sad for no obvious reason," Paul added. "Now I understand she was probably thinking of you." Mrs. Margaret was moved as she listened to her children talk. "You don't know how rewarding it is to see the three of you together," she said. "For 40 years, I carried the guilt of having a divided family. Now maybe you can get to know each other and become real siblings." It'll take time, Paul said honestly, but I want to try. Me too, Melissa agreed. And Richard, do you want to get to know our family? Very much, Richard replied. I've always felt like something was missing in my life. Maybe it was you. They talked for 2 more hours, sharing stories of their lives, discovering interesting coincidences and significant differences. Paul was a history teacher, passionate about books and knowledge. Melissa was a nurse, dedicated to caring for others. Richard was a businessman focused on results and efficiency. It's interesting how different we are, yet similar in some ways, Melissa observed. We all chose professions that involve taking care of something. Paul nurtures education, I care for people's health, and Richard manages his business. And we all inherited our mother's protective side, Paul added. When visiting hours ended, the 3 siblings had formed an initial connection. It wasn't instant brotherly love, but it was the beginning of something that could grow into a genuine family bond. Can we meet outside the hospital? Melissa suggested. Maybe for lunch this weekend. I'd love that, Richard replied. Actually, I'd like to see your homes, your lives, understand how you grew up. And we want to know about your life too, said Paul. It's hard to imagine a brother who grew up in such a different world from ours. Before leaving, Paul approached Mrs. Margaret. Mom, I'm still processing all this, he said, but I want you to know I'm not angry with you. I'm angry at the situation, at the circumstances that kept us apart, but not at you. And I want you to know you did the right thing by telling us the truth, Melissa added, even if it took 40 years. After Paul and Melissa left, Richard remained in the room with Mrs. Margaret. How do you think it went? Asked Mrs. Margaret. Better than I expected, replied Richard. They seem like good people, just as you said. They are, confirmed Mrs. Margaret. And so are you. I'm sure you'll all get along once you get to know each other better. Thank you for telling them the truth, said Richard. I know it wasn't easy. It was the right thing to do, answered Mrs. Margaret. And now, for the first time in 40 years, I feel like I have a complete family. For the rest of the week, Richard visited Mrs. Margaret every day. Her recovery continued to progress exceptionally well, and Dr. Richards confirmed she could be discharged on Friday. So now what? Asked Mike during one of the visits. Where will Mrs. Margaret live when she leaves the hospital? It was a question Richard had been avoiding but needed to face. Mrs. Margaret couldn't return to the small room at the back of Mike's house, at least not during her recovery. She needed a more comfortable environment and specialized care. I'd like you to live with me, Richard told Mrs. Margaret. At least during your recovery, I have enough space and I can hire nurses to help with your care. My son, that's very generous, but I'm not sure it's a good idea, Mrs. Margaret said hesitantly. Why not? Because we're still getting to know each other, she explained. Forcing such close living arrangements might create unnecessary tension. Then how about a compromise, suggested Richard. I'll rent an apartment near mine, comfortable and well located. You'd have your independence, but I'd be close by to help whenever you need. That sounds more reasonable, agreed Mrs. Margaret. And I want Mike to continue overseeing your care, Richard added. At least until you're fully recovered. Mr. Richard, I'm happy to keep helping, said Mike, but Mrs. Margaret also needs support from her other children. Now that they know about her, they'll want to be involved in her care too. Of course, Richard agreed. In fact, I think it would be good for all of us to take turns looking after her. It could be a way for us to get to know each other as a family. On Friday, Mrs. Margaret was discharged from the hospital. Richard had rented a furnished apartment in a building with 24-hour security, close to his own address. It was a comfortable space with 2 bedrooms, a spacious living room, and a pleasant view of the city. It's beautiful, said Mrs. Margaret when she saw the apartment. But isn't it a bit too luxurious for me? Nothing is too luxurious for you, Richard replied, and it's temporary, just until you decide where you want to live permanently. Paul and Melissa joined them to help Mrs. Margaret settle into the new apartment. It was the first time the 3 siblings had been together outside the hospital, and everyone felt a little awkward. How about we make lunch here, suggested Melissa. I can cook something simple. No need to trouble yourself, said Richard. I can order food from a restaurant. Melissa is a great cook, said Paul, Besides, it'd be cozier to have something homemade on our mother's first day out of the hospital. All right, Richard agreed. But I'll go to the store to get the ingredients. The trip to the store was eye-opening for Richard. He had never shopped at a regular supermarket, always delegating the task to staff or ordering everything online. Paul went with him, and it was interesting to see how a teacher with a modest salary made practical and budget-conscious choices. "Do you always buy these expensive brands?" asked Paul, watching Richard pick up premium products. "I never really thought about it," admitted Richard. "I usually just grab whatever's closest." "These simpler brands have the same quality," explained Paul, "and they cost half the price." It was a small but meaningful lesson for Richard about how most people lived, having to make careful financial choices with every purchase. Back at the apartment, Melissa prepared a delicious lunch with grilled chicken, rice, and salad. It was a simple meal, but made with love and care. As she cooked, she shared stories about her career as a nurse, the patients she cared for, and how she had chosen that path. "I always knew I wanted to take care of people," said Melissa, seasoning the salad. "Ever since I was little, I played doctor with my dolls." "Our mother always encouraged that," added Paul. "She said Melissa had a natural gift for healing." Richard observed the dynamic between the siblings, the ease with which they interacted after a lifetime together. He felt like an outsider trying to fit into an already formed family, yet he was grateful for the opportunity. "And you, Richard?" asked Melissa. "How did you decide to work with cars?" "Honestly, it was kind of by chance," Richard replied. "When I finished college, I got a job as a salesperson at a dealership. I discovered I had a talent for sales and for understanding what customers really wanted." "And what was it like building your company?" asked Paul, genuinely interested. "It was hard at first," Richard admitted. "I worked 16-hour days, saved every penny, reinvested everything into the business. It took me nearly 10 years to reach real financial stability." "You did all that alone?" asked Melissa. "Completely alone," Richard answered. "I had no family, no close friends who could help me. It was just me against the world." Mrs. Margaret, who was resting on the couch, listened to the conversation with a heavy heart. She could hear the loneliness in Richard's voice, could imagine how difficult it must have been for him to build his life without family support. "But now you're not alone anymore," said Mrs. Margaret. "Now you have family." "That's true," Richard agreed, smiling at her. "And that changes everything." Over lunch, they talked about future plans. Paul shared his dream of writing a book about U.S. history. Melissa spoke about her desire to specialize in pediatrics. For the first time in his life, Richard didn't have grand business expansion plans to share. "And you, Richard?" asked Paul. "What are your plans now?" "For the first time in my life, my plans don't just involve work," Richard replied. "I want to get to know both of you better. I want to help our mother with her recovery. I want to learn how to be part of a family." "That's beautiful," said Melissa, moved by her brother's sincerity. "And maybe I'll rethink some things at the company too," Richard continued. "I have employees who've worked with me for years, and I never took an interest in their personal lives. Mike made me see how important that is." "Speaking of Mike," said Mrs. Margaret, "where is he today? I miss him." "He was working, but he said he'd come visit you tonight," Richard answered. "He and Christine want to make sure you're settling into the apartment well." "They're special people," said Mrs. Margaret. "Mike saved my life both literally and figuratively. And now he's part of our extended family," said Richard. "I promoted him to shop manager, and he'll keep coordinating your medical care." After lunch, Paul suggested they take a walk around the neighborhood so Mrs. Margaret could get to know the area. It was an upper-middle-class neighborhood, very different from Queens, but also very different from the luxurious area where Richard lived. "It's the perfect middle ground," Melissa observed. "Comfortable but not intimidating." "That's exactly what I thought when I chose this place," Richard agreed. They walked slowly, matching Mrs. Margaret's pace as she was still recovering from surgery. They passed a playground, a pharmacy, a small grocery store, and a bakery. It was a welcoming and functional neighborhood. "Everything I need is close by," Mrs. Margaret said, satisfied. "And it's safe for an elderly woman to walk alone." "You won't be walking alone for a while," Richard said. "At least until you're fully recovered. Someone will always be with you." "My dear, I don't want to be a burden to you," Mrs. Margaret protested. You're not a burden, Melissa said firmly. You're our mother, and taking care of you is a joy, not an obligation. Exactly, Paul agreed. And now there are 3 of us to share the responsibility. It'll be easier for everyone. When they returned to the apartment, Mike, Christine, and the kids were waiting in the lobby. Luke ran to hug Mrs. Margaret as soon as he saw her. "Grandma Margaret," he shouted, "how do you like the new place?" "Very much, sweetheart," Mrs. Margaret replied, hugging the boy. "And you? How was school today?" It was touching to see how Mrs. Margaret had become a grandmother figure to Mike's children, and how they treated her with genuine affection. "We brought a cake," Christine said, "to celebrate your discharge from the hospital." "How thoughtful," Melissa said. "Come on, let's go upstairs and have the cake together." In the apartment, the 2 families mingled naturally. Paul talked with Mike about work and the economy. Melissa exchanged professional experiences with Christine, who also worked in healthcare as a nursing assistant. Richard played with the kids, something he'd never done before in his life. "Uncle Richard," Peter said, "are you going to live here with Grandma Margaret?" "No, Peter," Richard replied. "I live somewhere else, but I'll visit her every day." "Why don't you live with your family?" Luke asked with the innocent curiosity of children. "Because sometimes adults need separate homes," Richard explained. "But that doesn't mean we're not family." "Oh," Luke said, accepting the answer. "Like my grandpa, who lives in another house but comes for lunch with us every Sunday." The comparison made Richard smile. For kids, family relationships were simple. People who loved each other visited often no matter where they lived. Later that afternoon, Paul had a private conversation with Richard on the apartment balcony. "Can I be honest with you?" Paul asked. "Of course," Richard replied. "I'm still trying to process all this," Paul admitted. "A week ago, I thought I knew everything about my family. Now I find out I have an older brother who's a successful businessman. And I'm still coming to terms with not being an only child," Richard said. "It's strange for me too. The difference is, you seem to be adjusting better than I am," Paul said. "You're accepting this more naturally." "Maybe because I always felt like something was missing in my life," Richard explained. "Finding out I have family fills a void I've carried for decades, and I always felt complete with the family I knew," Paul said. "Discovering there's more makes me question other things I thought I knew about my life." "That's understandable," Richard said. "But maybe in time you'll see this as a gift rather than a complication." "I hope so," Paul said. "And I want you to know I'm trying. It's not easy, but I'm trying to accept you as my brother." "That's all I can ask," Richard replied. "And I'm also trying to learn how to be a brother. I've never had to think about anyone but myself before." When everyone had left by late afternoon, Richard found himself alone with Mrs. Margaret for the first time since she'd been discharged from the hospital. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Tired, but happy," Mrs. Margaret replied. "I can't remember the last time I felt so whole." "And the pain? Is your chest bothering you?" "A little, but nothing like before the surgery," she said. "It feels like my heart is working properly for the first time in years." "That's great," Richard said. "Tomorrow the private nurse will come for the first home visit." "You didn't need to hire a nurse," Mrs. Margaret protested. "Melissa could take care of me." "Melissa has her own job," Richard replied. "Besides, I want her to spend time with me as a sister, not as a professional caregiver." "You've thought of everything," Mrs. Margaret said, smiling. "I'm trying," Richard answered. "I want to make sure you have the best possible recovery." They had dinner together, a simple meal Richard had ordered from a nearby restaurant. It was the first time they'd been completely alone since reuniting, and both felt a little uneasy. "Can I ask you something?" Mrs. Margaret said. "Of course." "Are you happy, Richard?" she asked. "I mean, before we reunited, were you happy with your life?" Richard hesitated before answering. "I thought I was," he finally said. "I had success, money, professional recognition, but now I realize I wasn't truly happy. I was just functional. And now I feel like I'm discovering what real happiness is," Richard replied. "Having people who care about me, family responsibilities, reasons to live beyond work." "I'm glad to hear that," Mrs. Margaret said. "I always worried whether you'd found joy in life." "What about you?" Richard asked. Were you happy with Paul and Melissa? Did you build the family you always wanted? Yes and no, Mrs. Margaret answered. I was very happy with them. I love both my children deeply. But I always carried a sadness over losing you. It felt like a part of me was always missing. And now? Now I feel like I can finally be completely happy, she said. I have all three of my children with me, even if in different ways. In the weeks that followed, a family routine took shape. Richard visited Mrs. Margaret every morning before work and every evening after. Paul came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Melissa on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Mike and his family visited on Sundays, turning the apartment into a hub for family gatherings. Mrs. Margaret's recovery progressed exceptionally well. Within 3 weeks, she was walking normally and handling basic tasks without difficulty. Dr. Richards was impressed with her progress. Mrs. Margaret, you're recovering better than patients 20 years younger, he said during a follow-up appointment. Having a family that cares for you makes all the difference. Doctor, can I go back to work? Mrs. Margaret asked. Work? Dr. Richards replied, surprised. You don't need to work anymore, Mrs. Margaret. Your retirement should be enough to live comfortably now. It's just that I feel useless doing nothing, she explained. Richard, who was present at the appointment, had an idea. Mum, how about you come work with me? He suggested. How do you mean? She asked. At the company, Richard explained. Not heavy work, but something that gives you purpose. Maybe helping with customer service or human resources. You have life experience that would be valuable. Are you serious? Mrs. Margaret asked, her eyes brightening. Completely serious, Richard confirmed. And Melissa could work part-time in our occupational health clinic. Paul could give history lectures for our employees in the development programs. You want to employ the whole family? Asked Mrs. Margaret, laughing. Why not? Said Richard. Family businesses work very well when there's mutual trust and respect. Dr. Richards watched the conversation with satisfaction. Having a purpose is key to full recovery, he said. If Mrs. Margaret feels useful and active, her quality of life will be much better. When they left the doctor's office, Mrs. Margaret was visibly excited. Did you really mean what you said about the jobs? She asked. Absolutely, replied Richard. In fact, I've been rethinking a lot about how I run the company. Mike made me realize I treated employees like numbers, not people. Having you there could help humanize the workplace. And the others? Do you think Paul and Melissa would agree? Let's ask them, said Richard. But I think they'd be interested. That evening, during a family dinner at Mrs. Margaret's apartment, Richard presented his proposal to Paul and Melissa. Let me get this straight, said Paul. You want me to give history lectures to your employees? Exactly, confirmed Richard. Many of them never had the chance to study properly. It'd be a form of continuing education, something the company would highly value. And I'd work as an occupational nurse? Asked Melissa. Part-time, explained Richard. We have a small clinic at the company, but it's underused. With a qualified nurse, we could offer much better health care to our employees. It's an interesting offer, admitted Melissa. I could keep my current job in the mornings and go to your company in the afternoons. Exactly, said Richard. And our mother could work in customer service. She has a warm personality that'd be perfect for dealing with people. Son, are you sure this isn't just charity in disguise? Asked Mrs. Margaret. It's not charity, insisted Richard. It's a smart business decision. Companies that value human aspects have happier, more productive employees. You three would bring exactly that to the company. Paul, who had been thoughtful, finally spoke. You know, Richard, this could work for everyone, he said. I've always wanted a chance to teach outside a traditional school setting, and it'd be a way to understand your professional world better. So you accept? Asked Richard hopefully. I accept, said Melissa, but on one condition. I want to be treated like any other employee. No special privileges for being your sister. I accept too, said Paul. Same condition. And I accept wholeheartedly, said Mrs. Margaret. I'll finally get to work alongside my children. Perfect, said Richard, smiling. We'll start next week. The integration of Richard's family into the company had a surprising impact. Mrs. Margaret quickly became beloved by the employees, who sought her out not just for work matters, but also for personal advice. Her life experience and warm personality created a more human and welcoming environment. Melissa revolutionized the company clinic, implementing prevention and healthcare programs that significantly improved employee well-being. Paul developed a continuing education program that was highly sought after by employees wanting to expand their knowledge. "How are things at the company?" asked Mike during a Sunday visit. "Much better than I expected," replied Richard. "Their presence completely changed the workplace atmosphere. The employees are happier, more productive, and more engaged." "And the financial results?" asked Paul, curious. "Paradoxically, they're better than before," admitted Richard. "Happy employees work better, sell more, and take better care of customers." "Who would have thought humanizing the company would also be good for profits?" "That shouldn't be a surprise," said Melissa. "Motivated people always perform better than unmotivated ones." Christine, who was following the conversation, made an interesting observation. "It's amazing how everyone's lives have changed since you all reconnected," she said. "Not just yours, but ours too. Mike is much more fulfilled at work, the kids love having an extended family, and I feel like part of something bigger." "For me, it was a complete transformation," said Richard. "Before I worked for money and status. Now I work to support a family and create an environment where people can be happy." "And for me, it was closing a cycle," said Mrs. Margaret. "Finally, I can take care of all three of my children at the same time in the same place." "Mom," said Melissa, "can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course, dear." "Have you ever thought about getting married again?" asked Melissa. "I mean, now that your life is settled, wouldn't you like a companion?" "Mrs." Margaret laughed at the question. "My dear, at 70 years old with 3 grown children to care for, I think I already have enough family," she replied. "Besides, your father Jack was the love of my life. It would be hard to find someone to fill that space." "But don't you feel lonely?" Melissa pressed. "How could I feel lonely with you 3 visiting me every day?" asked Mrs. Margaret. "And with the honorary grandchildren Mike gave me. My life is fuller than ever." "Speaking of grandchildren," said Paul with a mischievous smile, "when are you going to give us real grandchildren, Richard?" Well," Richard stammered, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "I don't even have a girlfriend right now." "But would you like to?" asked Mrs. Margaret, interested in his answer. "After learning how to have a family?" "Yes," admitted Richard. "I think now I'd know how to be a good husband and father." "Then let's work on that," said Melissa, taking on the role of the family matchmaker. "You need to meet people outside of work. Leave the man alone," Paul laughed. "When the time is right, he'll find someone." 6 months after the reunion, the family had established a solid and harmonious routine. Mrs. Margaret had fully recovered from her surgery and was working part-time at Richard's company. Paul had taken charge of the employee continuing education program. Melissa divided her time between the hospital where she'd always worked and the company's medical clinic. Richard had changed profoundly. He was still a successful businessman, but now his motivation was different. Instead of accumulating wealth for status, he reinvested profits into employee benefits and social projects. "Mr. Richard," said Amanda, his secretary, during a meeting, "the numbers from last quarter were exceptional. Productivity increased by 20%, employee turnover dropped drastically, and customer satisfaction is at the highest level in the company's history." "And the costs?" asked Richard. "With all the benefits we implemented, expenses must have gone up." "They did initially," Amanda confirmed, "but the higher productivity and lower turnover more than made up for the investments. In the end, we're more profitable than before." "Who knew treating employees well would be good for business?" Richard remarked, laughing. "Mr. Richard," Amanda said hesitantly, "can I make a personal observation?" "Of course. You've changed so much," she said. "More relaxed, more human. The employees say it's a pleasure to work here now." "Thank you, Amanda," said Richard. "Finding my family changed my perspective on everything." "And we're all grateful for that," Amanda replied. That afternoon, Richard received an unexpected call. It was Dr. Richards. "Mr. Anderson, I'm calling with news about Mrs. Margaret," said the doctor. "Is something wrong?" Richard asked, immediately concerned. "Quite the opposite," Dr. Richards chuckled. "I just got her routine test results. Her heart is functioning perfectly, better than we expected. She's officially cured." "Cured?" Richard asked, hardly believing it. "Completely cured," Dr. Richards confirmed. "The surgery was a total success. With the care she's received and the positive family environment, her recovery has exceeded all expectations." "Doctor, thank you for everything," Richard said, emotional. "You gave me my mother back." "It was a pleasure caring for her," Dr. Richards replied. "And I can say I've rarely seen a family as close and devoted as yours." Richard immediately called Paul and Melissa to share the good news. They decided to throw a surprise party for Mrs. Margaret that night to celebrate her full recovery. The party was held at Mrs. Margaret's apartment with the whole extended family there. Richard, Paul, Melissa, Mike, Christine, and the kids. Mike brought a special cake. Melissa prepared their mother's favorite dishes, and Paul put together a slideshow of all the important moments since their reunion. "Mum," Richard said, raising a toast, "7 months ago I was a lonely man who thought I had no family. Today I'm a son, a brother, and a boss to people I love. Thank you for giving me a second chance. And thank you for fighting the illness and making a full recovery," Melissa added. "We don't know what we'd do if we lost you right after finding our whole family again." "Thank you for telling us the truth," said Paul, "for having the courage to bring the family together after all this time." Mrs. Margaret had tears in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "My dear children," she said, "this is my greatest dream come true. For 40 years I dreamed of the day I could have all 3 of my children together at the same table. Today that dream is real." "And now?" Luke asked with childlike curiosity. "Are you going to stay a family forever?" "Forever and always," Mrs. Margaret replied, hugging the boy. "Nothing will ever separate our family again." "Grandma Margaret," said Peter, "can you tell us a story?" "Of course, sweetheart," Mrs. Margaret answered. "What kind of story would you like to hear?" "The story of how you found your lost children," Luke said. "It's a long story," Mrs. Margaret said, "but it has a very happy ending." And as Mrs. Margaret told the story of her reunited family to the children, the adults watched with contentment. It was a simple but perfect scene, a grandmother telling stories to her grandchildren, grown children listening with interest, a complete and happy family. Richard looked around the table and realized he had found something he didn't know he was searching for. A purpose greater than just making money. People who loved him for who he was and not what he had. The feeling of belonging to something bigger than himself. "Mike," Richard said quietly, "thank you for bringing my mother to me." "Mr. Anderson," Mike replied, "thank you for showing me it's always worth doing the right thing, even when it seems impossible." 6 months later, the family's life had settled into a happy and productive routine. Richard had expanded the company to include social programs for the community. Paul had written the first chapter of his history book. Melissa had specialized in geriatric nursing. Mrs. Margaret had become the unofficial counselor for employees and clients of the company. One Sunday afternoon, as the whole family gathered for their weekly lunch, Richard made a special announcement. "Everyone, I have some news to share with you," he said, clearly nervous. "What news?" asked Melissa, curious. "I've met someone," said Richard, smiling shyly. "A girlfriend?" asked Mrs. Margaret, excited. "Yes," confirmed Richard. "Her name is Sarah. She's a psychologist who works with families. We met at a conference on human resources." "And?" pressed Paul. "Tell us more." "She's smart, kind, and has strong family values," said Richard. "And most importantly, she wants to meet all of you." "When can we meet her?" asked Mrs. Margaret. "If you'd like, she could come for lunch next Sunday," suggested Richard. "Of course we'd love that," they all said almost at once. "Uncle Richard's getting married?" asked Luke, excited. "Slow down, Luke," Richard laughed. "We're still getting to know each other. But yes, I'm seriously thinking about starting my own family." "And will we be the godparents?" asked Peter. "If it comes to that, absolutely," Richard promised. Mrs. Margaret watched everything with a heart full of gratitude. Her eldest son, who had grown up lonely and hardened by life, was finally learning to love and be loved. "My son," she said, holding Richard's hand, "you don't know how happy it makes me to see you find love." "You taught me that family is the most important thing in life," Richard replied. Now I want to build my own family, but I'll never forget where I came from. A year after the reunion, Richard's company had become a benchmark for corporate social responsibility. The story of the family reunion had spread among employees and clients, inspiring other businesses to adopt more humane practices. Mrs. Margaret, now 71, was more active and happier than she had been in decades. Her near-fatal experience had turned into the greatest blessing of her life, reuniting with her complete family. Paul had finished his first book and was working on his second. Melissa had become the supervisor of the company's occupational health division and was planning to open her own clinic. Mike had been promoted to director of operations and was enrolled in a business administration degree sponsored by the company. Richard and Sarah were engaged, planning a simple but meaningful wedding with the entire extended family present. Sarah had blended perfectly into the family, bringing her own positive energy to the group. On a special evening, exactly 1 year after the day Mike had wheeled Mrs. Margaret into the meeting room, the whole family gathered for a celebratory dinner. "A year ago," said Richard, raising a toast. "Mike told me my mother was my last chance. He didn't know she wasn't just my last chance. She was my first chance at having a real family." "A year ago," said Mrs. Margaret, "I thought I'd leave this world without making peace with my eldest son. Now I know I'll leave knowing my family is complete and happy." "Don't talk about leaving," protested Melissa. "You'll be with us for many, many more years." "Of course I will," Mrs. Margaret laughed. "I need to meet the great-grandchildren you'll give me." "About that," said Richard, exchanging a glance with Sarah, "we have some news for you." "What news?" asked Paul. "You're going to be uncles," Sarah announced, smiling. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was broken by shouts of joy and hugs. Mrs. Margaret cried with emotion, finally having the prospect of meeting the grandson she had dreamed of for so long. "When?" asked Melissa, moved. "In 7 months," replied Sarah, "just in time to be the first grandchild of the reunited family." "Grandma Margaret," shouted Luke, "you're going to be a real great-grandma." "Yes, I am, my angel," answered Mrs. Margaret, hugging the children, "and you'll be the baby's older siblings." It was the perfect ending to a story that had begun with despair and pain. The family that had been torn apart by circumstances and misunderstandings was now closer than ever, growing and strengthening each day. Mike Johnson watched everything with satisfaction. His desperate decision to take Mrs. Margaret to meet his boss had changed all their lives for the better. He had saved a life, reunited a family, and transformed a company. "Mike," said Richard Anderson, approaching his friend, "how can I thank you for everything you've done for our family?" "Mr. Anderson," replied Mike, "seeing you all this happy is all the thanks I need." "You saved my life in more ways than you realize," said Richard. "Not only did you give me back my mother, but you taught me what truly matters in life." "And we became family too," added Christine. "Our lives changed for the better ever since we met you." "We're all family now," confirmed Mrs. Margaret. "A big, united and loving family." As the night went on, conversations revolved around plans for the future: Richard and Sarah's wedding, the baby's birth, the company's expansion projects, the books Paul was writing, the clinic Melissa wanted to open. It was a family looking ahead, building dreams together, supporting each other in their ambitions and plans, far different from the group of strangers who had gathered a year earlier in a hospital room. "You know what's most amazing about this whole story?" said Sarah, who had become an integral part of the family. "What?" several asked at once. "It's that every person here became better because of the others," Sarah observed. "Richard learned to value family. Mrs. Margaret got her children back. Paul and Melissa gained a brother. Mike grew professionally. And even I found the family I always wanted." "It's true," agreed Melissa. "We're all better together than we were apart. And most importantly," added Mrs. Margaret, "we learned that it's never too late to fix what was broken, to forgive what needed forgiving, and to build what should have always existed." When the night ended and everyone prepared to go home, Mrs. Margaret asked to speak with Richard alone. "My son," she said, "there's something I never told you and I want to say it now." "What is it, Mom?" "I always knew you'd become an extraordinary man," said Mrs. Margaret. "Even when you were little, I saw a special determination and intelligence in your eyes. I knew you could achieve anything you wanted in life. But I almost lost the most important thing, said Richard. I almost lost you forever. But you didn't, replied Mrs. Margaret, smiling. And that proves you really can achieve whatever you want. You wanted a family, and you brought one together. You wanted my forgiveness, and you got it. You wanted to build a compassionate company, and you did. Now you want to start your own family, and I'm sure you'll succeed at that too. Thank you for believing in me, said Richard, hugging his mother. Thank you for giving me the chance to be your mother again, answered Mrs. Margaret. The end of the story. And so, a story that began with a sweaty mechanic pushing a wheelchair and saying, "You're her last chance," became the reunion of a family and the transformation of many lives. Sometimes, the most desperate moments can lead to the happiest endings when brave people choose to do the right thing, no matter the consequences. What did you think of this story of family reunion and reconciliation? Were you moved by Mrs. Margaret and Richard Anderson's journey? Share below which part touched your heart the most, and if you've ever experienced something similar. Don't forget to leave a like if the story moved you, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other stories that will stir your emotions. Your participation means so much to us.